Hi, everyone. Welcome to Odyssey's Storytelling's October Digital Edition. I'm Steve Braun. This month, we have the quintessential theme for 2020, Stranger Things. Let me tell you, we've got 6 stories all dealing with strange. And when it comes to strange, nobody does it better than my co-curator. And so without further ado, here's Roscoe.
Thanks, Steve. When I was a freshman in high school, my friend John had a few people over to his house, about 8 to 10. It wasn't a big party or anything, but it was October in Kansas, and the got darker earlier in the day. It started to feel a little chilly. So we all gathered in his basement to just hang out. And one of the people at the gathering brought a Ouija board with them. And being a freshman in October, I was 2 months roughly into my high school career. So I was still trying to feel out, how do I hang with upperclassmen? How do I hold my own? So when people asked for volunteers for the Ouija board, I wasn't the first person to jump forward to the planchette. So everyone opened the Ouija board. 4 people gathered around the planchette. And I should mention, this party had girls. So I was trying to be cool. I adopted that other quintessential teenager thing to do, which is hang back, subtly mock everyone else, and try to look like the cool guy who's too good for everything. So as the 4 people gathered around the planchette and there were oohs and ahs as it moved around the board, I stood back and I had company and my friend Brad, and we just subtly mocked people as they were going along. Now, we had turned the lights down in the basement. John brought out this candle, but it looked like a Folgers coffee can with just wax at the bottom and a wick. And he lit this candle, and the atmosphere was pretty creepy almost immediately. And my joking became somewhat of a safety mechanism with how creeped out I was inching up and up. So Brad and I sat back, and we're cracking jokes like, hey, ask it if it watches John when he's whacking it, and everyone's, kind of having a good time. But after a while, our jokes got kind of annoying. And so we thought that the people started moving the planchette around because they started asking it, are you mad at Roscoe and Brad? Oh, yes, immediately. What do you want to do with them? KILLTHEM. And, we're laughing it off and going, you assholes, you're doing that. Like, no, we're not. And I think I could have allowed myself to believe there wasn't anything else going on, except that the flame in the candle started to circle around that Folgers can. It circled around until the whole thing was spinning. And I'm like, John, what the hell's going on with your candle? And he's got a planchette, I don't know. It never does this. It never does this. And Brad and I seriously ran up John's stairs and out of his house because I don't mess with that kind of shit. When stranger things come, I get going. And I never figured that out. I never dialed in. I pride myself on not dialing into whatever frequency ghosts and goblins and whatever happen. And I just maintain that dial against everything else that try to change it. But I don't mess around with that. But our storytellers today have some fantastically eerie stories. And our first storyteller is a professional concert bassoonist. And there is no better music to bring us into Stranger Things than a little bassoon music. So without further ado, for the first time with Odyssey, I welcome Cassandra Bendickson.
My first wedding was at a haunted house. To be fair, Nick and Victoria didn't tell us that the house was haunted, but they were staying there for the summer. They actually lived in Tucson, and they were staying there for the summer at her family's old gigantic house. Her grandparents had been married there under a tree in the backyard, and there was a view of a little valley and a bunch of trees, and it sounded really nice. Tucson's hot in July, and this would be a lot less hot, so it sounded good. In addition, we'd be road tripping to Minnesota already because my fiance's grandparents were having a big party for their 50th wedding anniversary. It'd be a fun detour. Brett and I, that's my fiance, wanted to get married, but we didn't want the hassle of a wedding. We didn't want all of the big trappings and tradition. His family was all in Minnesota. Mine was all in Arizona. His was less mobile, but mine felt more complicated somehow. Both of our parents were divorced, and our dads had remarried, but not our moms. So that whole giving away the bride thing felt pretty awkward. Which, I mean, what's to give away, right? Like, does anybody give the groom away? That's just, it's kind of antiquated and silly. We didn't like it. And we'd already been living together for about a year and talking about getting married for most of that time. We just wanted to be married. We wanted to skip that stuff like when people clink a spoon on a glass and then the groom and the bride have to find each other and kiss. We didn't want to do that. I had been to a wedding as a kid where that kept happening and the groom was nowhere to be found. So I definitely didn't want that in my wedding. And what about our friends? Like, should we make them go to Minnesota? It just felt really complicated. I didn't want a big expensive dress that I'd have to wear once and deal with my whole life. And then neither of us were religious. So a Minnesota wedding meant getting married in the church he grew up in. We cared about not hurting people, but not enough to fake our way through ceremonies that we didn't believe in. The part that did sound fun about a wedding was a big party with cake and food we didn't have to cook ourselves. But we could do that anytime. We could do that in our backyard, which is what we wound up doing. So we upset everybody and eloped to this tiny town in New York where our friends were staying. We'd been inspired by the story of the swing. I don't know if I mentioned the rope swing under the tree. There was a really pretty little rope swing under this tree that they got married under. And so that inspired us. And also the date was working out so that we could get married on the same date that Brett's grandparents had been married 50 years earlier. So it felt like kismet. Lots of good omens. So that July, we drove from Tucson to the Hudson River Valley in upstate New York to this tiny little town called Stone Ridge. We actually drove right through it and missed it. We had to turn around and come back. The town was too small and the house is right up off the street. And I guess we'd been expecting some kind of big driveway or something grand. What we found instead was an old Dutch colonial, 4 stories high, so still a very big house, with a small kind of nondescript front porch, not the grand entry that you might expect, and an old plaque reading Tack Tavern, established 1772. It just seemed old and big, but not old and haunted. That's right, 1772, before the Revolutionary War. Its original address was actually on the King's Highway, and once we finished with all that King business in the war, they changed to the Post Road or Main Street. It was big enough even then to host George Washington's entire regiment, which it did, and some reports say that George Washington himself stayed there. Some reports say that he stayed across the street, but that's crap because he totally stayed in the house that we got married in. It was built as a private house, but also served as an inn and a school. And then it was the county courthouse for a while when the British burned down Kingston in like 1777 or something like that. I looked the house up trying to get more information and found out that Gertrude Stein and Hemingway had both stayed there as guests of Victoria's possibly greater aunt. Not sure how many greats that should be. So you'll believe me when I say a lot has happened within those walls. So we finally get there. Nick greeted us at the door and showed us around. This house was really old, with stairs in the entryway next to a smallish kind of space that was barely big enough for us and our bags. He took us through a great room to the side of that had been the original tavern. I mean, when it was built, it wasn't a tavern, it was a residence, but then it became one. Giant oak beams crossed the ceiling, really huge ones, and a huge person-sized fireplace stood across from the door with 2 carved figures staring out into the room. The carved figures were a man and a woman, and they were about 4 feet tall, with dour-looking faces and eyes that tracked you as you walked through. So right away, a little bit creepy. There was a wooden table as long as the room, and there had definitely probably been knife fights in there because it was a tavern, but the room now mostly served as a pass-through to the kitchen, which is where we headed next. I actually don't remember much about this floor, but I remember the old creepy watching wooden figures. They made quite the impression. So the kitchen was big and airy with lots of windows and a door to the outside garden where we wound up spending a bunch of time for breakfast and stuff like that. A butler's pantry behind the kitchen led to stairs to a second floor, and that's where our hosts were staying, in the servants' quarters, the old servants' quarters. To the left, so their quarters were to the right, and to the left was a closed door right at the top of the stairs. Nick told us that the door was the original servants' entrance to the main house, and that we should just go the other way. Nobody is supposed to go this way. It's fine. Nick led us back down through the kitchen, through the old tavern, through the entryway, where we grabbed our bags and headed up to the 4th floor of the house where we were going to be staying. As he guided us up, we paused just briefly outside the old 2nd floor great room. It was large and old-fashioned and actually really kind of pretty, with an antique couch sitting at an angle in the middle. Nick called it the parlor, where the family or fancier guests, like George Washington, would spend their time way back when it was a tavern. But this room wasn't what you would call welcoming. This room had a feeling. On the opposite side of the room from the stairs stood that closed doorway that we had seen from the servants' quarters. It looked like it would be much quicker to just come up that way and cut across and go up the stairs. But when I asked about it and accused our host of wanting more privacy or just wanting to make us walk more as a prank, he turned serious. "Oh no," he said. "We don't use this room. This one is off limits." I asked if it was because the room was a bit fancy. Like, were they worried about things getting damaged or foot traffic, or did the regular occupants have weird rules? Because they were just there for the summer. There was a regular occupant during the rest of the year. He answered that the room did not enjoy being disturbed. They themselves did not disturb this room. So we continued up the stairs, finding a white room with a big window and an attached bathroom on the top floor of the house. Both rooms had those angled gable walls. That means that that's the exterior wall of the house that go all the way from the ceiling down to the floor. And the bathroom had a big clawfoot tub and 2 steps off to the side up to a wide angled access panel, the same angle as the roof line, which I thought was confusing. Weren't we already on the top floor? I mean, we were kind of in the attic. Where could that door possibly go? And then, you know, in the way of visits, you settle in and you put your stuff down and you go back downstairs and hang out with your friends. Once, later that day, I snuck through that shortcut. When Brett had wandered upstairs and disappeared for a while, I went up there, up the servants' stairs, through that door. That was downstairs. Sorry, I jumped a little bit. Through the door on the 2nd floor into that fancy parlor and started to cross through. It had been a long day, and I figured this would be quicker. I didn't think anything of it, closed the door behind me, and looked around a little. This was a pretty room. I was sure Nick was just having a laugh, and that though Victoria had said the house creeped her out when she was 10, I figured everyone thinks old houses are creepy, especially when they're little and their house is older than their country. It wasn't until I was passing the couch that I had second thoughts. I was intruding. I was breaking the rules that had been laid out for me by my hosts and maybe even that room before my hosts had ever come there. It seemed to constrict and grab at my stomach as I passed by, heading for the stairway. The room did not appreciate being disturbed, and it wasn't until I reached the 3rd floor that I felt at ease again. When I told Brett what had happened, he smiled the way you would at a toddler with a tall tale and came back downstairs with me to rejoin our friends. We didn't bother mentioning it to them at that point. Later that night, I was upstairs alone on the top floor. I thought as long as I went the long way around and stayed out of that fancy room, there would be no problem. I didn't break any rules. It's all cool. Everyone else had stayed downstairs in the kitchen, a whole house and a whole, 3 floors away from where I was. It was so beautifully quiet. I idled at the sink for a while, brushing my teeth or, messing with my hair, or plucking something, and enjoyed the silence. Brett and I had been together in a car for a week. We had stayed with another friend for a day or 2, and now we were here with more friends. I was enjoying the hell out of some much-needed solitude. In the mirror over the sink and beyond my shoulder, I could see the 2 steps and the odd access panel on the wall. I thought again, what could be on the other side of that panel? So I turned away from the mirror and started to look at the panel. The stairs were worn with that little indentation that they get, like really old stairs when you've used them a whole bunch. They had a little indentation there. But the panel looked like it hadn't been moved in ages. It might have even been painted shut. So I got no clues from inspecting the panel. And I didn't continue because, it's just a panel, right? I turned back to the mirror and the task of cleaning my face for the wedding, which was the next day. And as I stared into the mirror, I began to feel a closeness creeping in. The panel loomed large in the mirror behind me, and the hairs on my arms and neck rose up. I was not alone. I suddenly became very afraid to look at that panel that I had just inspected and kept my eyes locked onto the mirror instead. Was the panel now open? Was there like a big rectangle of black there where the panel had been? The temperature in the room dropped and I felt a cold wind from behind me. A hostile cloud of aggression emanated from the panel and creeped towards me. It needed me to leave. I needed to leave that room right now. And in my head, I heard a whisper screamed, "Get out!" For the rest of our visit, I made my poor sweet fiancé come up 3 flights of stairs with me every time I needed anything from the room, especially to use the bathroom. The next day, tired of having to go upstairs with me for things like hair clips or socks or a book, Brett took it upon himself to fetch something for me from our room on the 4th floor, which is no big deal for him. He hadn't had any kind of experience. No problem. While the rest of us relaxed, he tried the shortcut. He came back pale and breathless and clearly rattled. Something had chased him through that room. Something unseen and unheard, but definitely felt. It was then that Victoria shared with us her grandfather's reports of poltergeists in the attic and strange happenings in other parts of the house, and we remembered, oh yeah, she said that the house was creepy. All things that she had probably told us before, but, people say things about old houses. We hadn't thought anything of it. In the midst of this, we did manage to get married. We kicked off our adventure with the best karmic coincidences possible under the tree where Victoria's grandparents had been married, and they had a long, happy marriage. And on John and Dolores' 50th wedding anniversary, who were Brett's grandparents and 2 of the most wonderful people ever. Nick and Victoria were our witnesses. Their teenage son took all our photos, and a cross-eyed justice of the peace named Daryl something was the officiant. Neither one of us remember anything he said except something beautiful about rings being circles, and he definitely ended with husband and wife, or maybe even wife and husband because he was a cool guy, but none of that man and wife bullshit. My amazing mother had figured out our plan before we left, and thanks to her, I had a simple, pretty dress from Sears, a little bouquet of sweetheart roses, and some flowers for Brett and Nick and Victoria and their son that we got from a local shop. Afterwards, we took a long drive together while Victoria made some kind of soup, and the next day we left for a bed and breakfast in Niagara Falls. We had dinner with an old friend of Brett's, who my son now calls his other mother, and then continued our drive to Minnesota for the anniversary party and the rest of the way home to Arizona. 23 years married now, and we still love our road trips. It was kismet. Years later, when that 2nd floor parlor room's furnishings were being cleared out to make room for a new owner, one of the movers reported sitting down on that angled couch in the almost empty room. Nothing had been said to them about the disposition of the room or its contents. They didn't have any clues. And one of the movers said, "I sat down on that couch in there all by myself, but somebody else was there with me. I could feel them. I couldn't see nobody, but somebody was sitting on that couch with me." Likewise, our friend Victoria, being very aware of all of these issues, consulted a psychic because she wanted to bring the creepy figures from the fireplace home to Tucson. And they were creepy. They watched you. I she had sentimental attachment to them. Horrified, the psychic said, no, 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 no. Those two dour-looking wooden half-people need to stay exactly where they are. Even moving them a foot or to a different room or to clean the soot off of them would disrupt the entire house and bring whatever bad karma might be attached to them to a new home. Only bad things could come of that choice. Victoria did not bring them to Tucson. She left them there, leaving well enough alone. And as far as I know, they still stand there, guarding the giant tavern fireplace, glaring and silently tracking the paths of all who enter the Sally Tack Tavern. Built in 1772, where George Washington definitely stayed with his whole regiment 220 years before we were married.
That was a great story. Let's hear it for Cassandra one more time. Woo! In case you were wondering what the Sally Tack Tavern looks like, I've got it in the background, thanks to Roscoe. Our next storyteller is a regular on the Odyssey stage and a great volunteer for our group. He's a self-employed natural builder and loves to tell stories about his many travels. Just looking at him, you wouldn't think Joe is strange at all. And then you hear his stories. Friends, Joe Silins.
In the summer of 2013, I traveled to central Mexico for a week-long natural building training. The training center was set in a beautiful wooded canyon outside a small town in the rural Mexican state of Tlaxcala. And everything about that week was magical. I learned lots about natural building from passionate people who had built lots of magical structures in that little valley. I was immersed in the Spanish language and Central Mexican culture, being the only gringo in a class of 25 and the only person from a primarily English-speaking country as well. So it was truly an immersive experience. And we ate so much delicious Mexican food that week. We probably averaged between 3 and 4 hours seated around dining tables, enjoying each other's company, speaking Spanish, and eating this delicious vegetarian Mexican food, for which this training center was really well renowned. And we'd start each day with a short walk down a forest road. We'd circle up and do a round of stretches. We would greet the sun, a sun salutation with our arms wide open, and then we'd go on to have breakfast and proceed with the morning's classes. So it was that at the end of this first week, a lot of us didn't want the fun to end. And so a number of friends planned a trip to the nearby mountains for a Firefly Festival. So we wrapped up our final sessions, we said our goodbyes, and then we piled into one of the cars for the journey. And so I joined up with David, Rodrigo, Leon, and Damaris, and we set off. But I should back up here and say that I almost didn't go on this trip. The last day or two, I wasn't really feeling well. I was starting to feel a little bit strange, and my discomfort was growing. I debated staying put and just kind of taking it easy at the natural training center. But in the end, my lust for adventure and for new experiences won over, and I joined my friends for the trip. So the Firefly Festival was located in the mountains nearby, near the town of Nanacamilpa. And in Nanacamilpa is the region that is most renowned for pulque in all of Mexico. And pulque is an alcoholic beverage. It's made from the fermented sap of an agave. And it's kind of like, it's hard to describe the taste of it, but it's kind of like a combination of a milkshake with a malt beverage, which might not sound that delicious, but it is delicious. I love pulque, and I had discovered it on a previous trip to Mexico. It comes in a variety of different flavors, from original to guanabana, oat, strawberry, melon, a real myriad of flavors. And I almost didn't try some during this visit. I'd been before, and it was really good pulque, I knew. But since I was just having this growing discomfort, this growing kind of pressure building up. I almost didn't have some, but my friends, they persuaded me. Apparently pulque has a variety of beneficial properties, from spiritual and magical to also curative properties. And so they said, oh, this might just be the thing that you need to kind of help you in your ailment. And so I tried some, and it seemed to be working for a little while, but we kind of got ready to pile back in the cars, and I was just right back to feeling bad. And I had this growing discomfort, growing unease as we continued into the mountains to this preserve, this visitor center where the Firefly Festival was going to be. So it was probably just before dusk when we rolled up, and we pulled into this parking lot, and immediately I made a beeline for this row of outhouses. And I can't convey to you the sense of relief that I had as I just emptied my bowels in this outhouse, and just the euphoria that I got, after being able to release this pressure that had been building for days, as it seemed. So I kind of finish up. I want some extra toilet paper in my pocket, as I'm suspicious that I might be back later on that night, and wash my hands, and then I join up with my friends. And this festival, it wasn't super well organized, so we kind of had to search around and figure out what was going on. We asked around a little bit, and then we discovered that we weren't going to be able to get onto a tour for at least another 3 to 4 hours. So we had some time to kill. And so a few of us kind of hung around and played hacky sack for a little while, as you do with some friends from a natural building training. There were some people who and just explored around. And as darkness set in, it started getting colder. And I hadn't really prepared that well in terms of clothing. I think I had some long johns on and like a long sleeve shirt and some pants, but we were pretty high in the mountains. And as night set in, it was dropping maybe to the 50s and then down to the mid 40s. And so I was trying to convince my friends, I was starting to, feel some pressure building up again. I just wanted my friends to take me home, but they weren't having any of that. And so we hang out for a little while. And then finally, it's our time to head out into the mountains for our Firefly Tour. And so we all gather, we've got a guide, we're walking through the forest without any headlamps. This guy just knew the forest trail by heart. And we're probably walking maybe for about a half hour or so. And then finally, we start to see some fireflies appearing off in the darkness, just like this glimmer and then fade. And it was pretty cool because growing up in Arizona, I had never really seen that many fireflies, which is part of the reason that I really wanted to go to this festival. And while there were some fireflies, there weren't a ton of fireflies. And at one point, the tour guide pipes up after he's been quiet for a while, and he says, "Oh, it's a shame that there aren't as many fireflies here as there were on the earlier tour. Was anyone here on the earlier tour and saw how many fireflies there were earlier?" And then one guy behind us chimes in. He's like, "Oh, yes, I was here. And yeah, there were so many more fireflies on the earlier tour." So it was kind of suspicious. We're all a little bit suspicious of just the motives of the tour guides and the organization. We'd been promised some bread and coffee earlier, which had run out, and but we put it aside. We were in this forest, in this magical place, in the midst of these fireflies, and so we continue on. And at this point, I was starting to get pretty cold, and I must have communicated it to the others at one point, because I worked out this deal between David and myself, and he had this beautiful hand-woven poncho on, and I worked out a deal that I was allowed to wear David's poncho if I carried his cowboy boots. And David was an interesting character. He's kind of like a cross between a yogi and a cowboy. He was a kid from upper middle class family in Mexico City, And he really wanted to walk through the forest barefoot and like feel that connection with the ground, feel the earth beneath his feet as he walked through this magical forest. And I was more than willing to carry his boots for the moment while I got to wear his nice hand-woven poncho. And so we're walking through the forest, we continue, and we're enjoying the evening. And all of a sudden, off in the distance, you can hear these motors revving and lights cutting through the forest. And it turns out there was a group of ATVers who were in this area kind of joyriding through this preserve that they weren't supposed to be in. And so they kind of stop at a trail junction up ahead of us. We don't have any lights on or anything, so they can't see us. But David gets this idea, you know, he's in this forest and he's like, I'm going to tell these people that they need to not be here, that they're not allowed to be here. And of course, like, you know, gringo who's heard stories of, you know, narcos and crime and violence in Mexico, I'm convinced that, you know, it's probably like drug lords or something traveling through the forest. And I'm like really trying to convince David not to go talk to them. But he goes and he talks with them, and, you know, we can't hear what they're saying, but eventually these people just laugh and drive off into the night. And we continue on, kind of looping back around towards the visitor center. And so we finally arrive back at the visitor center parking lot. And of course, you know, I make a beeline for the row of outhouses at that point. You know, my destination for the evening. And we kind of regroup and we head back home for the evening. We stop for a little bit of street food on the way. I kind of watch my friends longingly as they enjoy these delicious goods like empanadas and tacos and things, which I of course can't eat at that point. And then we continue on to one of my friends' houses who lived kind of on the way back to the Natural Building Center. And so we were going to spend the night there. Her mom was out of the house for the evening, so we kind of had the place to ourselves. And so everybody starts, you know, climbing upstairs and piling into beds and bunk beds and things. And I tell my friends that, oh no, I'm gonna stay downstairs. It's probably best for me not to bother you all if I have to make any, you know, surprise bathroom runs this evening. And, you know, my friends were so sweet. They're asking me like, are you sure, like, you don't want to hang out with us and hang out? But, you know, I knew for my own comfort that the best spot for me was downstairs, even though it was my last night to hang out with those friends, which was kind of a bummer. So I kind of climb down the stairs, get myself set up, and curl up, climb into bed. And, you know, we all travel for different reasons. You know, many of us travel to far off lands for new experiences and connections, to see exotic new landscapes or cultures. But, you know, when you're not feeling right, when something's wrong, sometimes what we really need is just a warm, cozy bed to curl up in, with a big roll of toilet paper nearby and a bathroom to use.
Thanks, Joe. I also want to thank Joe personally for inserting a scatological story into the Stranger Things show. That always warms my heart. Our next storyteller is not a stranger to Odyssey. She's a fantastic storyteller, and the story she's about to share comes from a place of intellectual and emotional curiosity about the indigenous people's belief regarding the trickster. So her intention is not to be culturally insensitive, and any mistakes or errors about the underlying lore is not intentional. In fact, we could probably chalk that up to the trickster. But without any further comment, let me give you Jan Stapleman with her story about the trickster.
About 10 years ago, my friends and I wandered into the territory of a mythical creature known as the trickster, and things got a little creepy. I carpooled down from Denver to northern New Mexico with a group of friends from the Colorado Mountain Club to do a 4-day backpack. On the first night, we all met up at a developed campground located at the convergence of two rivers, the Red River and the Rio Grande. This large campground was shaped like a wedge, so you could walk out to the point and look down over and see the two rivers coming together down below. It was near the community of Trishus, where the Milagro Beanfield War was filmed, and also near Taos and several Native American reservations and pueblos. So not only are the two rivers coming together there, but several diverse cultures have come together and are coexisting in that area. We were there to backpack in the Trucias Peaks region in the Sangre de Cristo mountain range. I rode down with my friends Gay and Bob in Bob's SUV, which we affectionately refer to as the Bobmobile. It has transported us to so many fun adventures like this one. The guy who organized the backpack, Ryan, had a late afternoon meeting in Denver, so we all knew he was going to arrive very late that evening. So we just pitched our tents, hung out together for a while, and ate our last meal for a few days that wasn't freeze-dried. Gay is an experienced backpacker, but she had an eerie feeling in that campground. So she pitched her tent right next to mine. We had kind of a condominium thing going on. Bob carried his gear somewhere off on the other side of that large campground. And there were a lot of other campers there too. So our little group was spread out among the other campers. As it got dark, a warm breeze just drifted in, and it almost felt like a mysterious energy moving through the campground. In fact, it made us look around and go, what was that? I reminded Gay, we're in Trickster country. According to the beliefs of several Native American tribes, including the Navajo, the Trickster, otherwise known as Coyote, is a shapeshifter, sometimes taking the form of a coyote or a raven or some other creature. He isn't necessarily evil, but he's known for playing tricks. Eventually, we were all crashed out, and I was sleeping hard in my little backpacking tent when all of a sudden, in the night, the guy who organized the trip, Ryan, shows up outside my tent, and he starts rocking me back and forth, violently throwing me around, and he's talking all this crazy stuff about he's so glad all of his kids are there. Ryan always refers to the people on his trips as his kids. And I'm being tossed back and forth in there, and I yell out, "Stop it!" And then it was totally quiet. I lay there wondering, was that real? I groped for my watch. I looked at the time. It was 10 minutes after 1. I really couldn't tell if it was a dream because it was so real, and being tossed back and forth was so jolting and physical. In the morning, we all woke up and started packing up, and I saw Ryan on the other side of the campground. I ran over and I said, "Ryan, did you come over to my tent in the night and mess with me?" And Ryan said, "How could I do that? I don't know what your tent looks like. How could I find you in the dark among all these other campers?" Well, I really didn't know how he could. So Gay and Bob and I pile into the Bobmobile, and we're going to meet a couple of vans that are going to transport us up into the mountains to drop us off so we can start our backpack. And as soon as I get settled in the Bobmobile, I said, "Wow, I had the craziest dream last night." And Bob said, "Man, I did too." And I'm kind of annoyed because Bob starts telling about his dream and I wanted to tell about my dream. And Bob said, "I dreamed that Ryan came over to my tent in the night and he started rocking me back and forth, and he's tossing me around forcefully, and he's talking all this crazy stuff." I got goosebumps up the back of my neck, and I said, "That was my dream." He said, "No way." I said, "Yes, it was exactly the way you described it." And he said, "It was so real and physical." And I said, "I know." And the Bobmobile is swerving down the road as we're all freaking out. And then Gay said, "I heard you yell, 'Stop it,' but I was wide awake then. It was quiet. There was no one around." And then Bob asked, "Do you know what time it was when you had the dream?" Because he said, "I looked at my watch when I woke up and it was 10 minutes after 1. Whoa, what was this? Was this Coyote manipulating our dreams? We were still baffled by this when we got to the vans, and we loaded up, and the vans were driving us up into the mountains to drop us off. And I happened to look out a side window down to the road below, and there is a coyote running alongside the van like a dog would do. What the hell? Was Coyote tracking us? This 4-day backpack was one of the most star-crossed trips I've ever been on. We hiked through some beautiful country, but despite all of our maps and GPS units and best intentions, we got off track almost as soon as we got started. We kept correcting, but we were plagued with route finding problems, which made for really long hiking days to get to the spots where we wanted to camp. And then there was the miscommunication with the van drivers about exactly where they were supposed to pick us up on the last day when we were dead tired and dragging ourselves out to the road to meet them. Our strange identical dreams were analyzed during stories around the campfire. Ryan has always had a vivid imagination, but I've really never known him to be someone to play tricks. And I couldn't imagine how he could pull this off anyway. My little backpacking tent, it's really little, but it has these rain flies that are staked out to the ground almost 2 feet all the way around the tent. So I couldn't figure out how anyone could wiggle underneath the rain flies to get next to the actual wall of my tent to be able to toss me around like that, and then just suddenly disappear and the stakes are undisturbed, to say nothing of being in two places at the same time. Coyote was with us throughout the entire trip. We didn't always see him, but he serenaded us every night with his eerie yipping song. And on the last night, Coyote and his crew gathered on the other side of a little pond from where we were all camped. And in the middle of the night, they suddenly sent up the loudest, most otherworldly chorus. We were all startled awake, sitting bolt upright in our tents because they were so close and it was so loud. And then they stopped as suddenly as they started, and it was dead quiet. Gay's tent was next to mine again, and I said, "Gay, are you awake?" Gay said, "Yeah, and I need to pee." I said, "I do too." Gay said, "But I don't want to get out of my tent." I said, "I know, I don't either." Well, folks, chivalry is not dead, because one of the guys camped nearby us overheard, and he popped out of his tent, armed with his hiking poles, and stood guard while Gay and I peed in the dark on the other side of our tents. As many times as Gay and I have crawled out of our tents in the middle of the night and peed alone in the dark on trips like this, on this night, it was comforting to have him standing guard. He rotated his headlamp from side to side over the surrounding terrain like a 6-foot-tall human lighthouse. I don't know why my dream converged with Boggs on that first night, just like the two rivers were converging down below. I don't know if the Trickster was behind all the crazy things that happened on this trip. I'll probably never really understand what that was about. But you know what? That's okay, because it was the mystery that made it so magical.
Thank you, Jan. That was a great story. We have a tradition at our live Odyssey shows where after intermission, we pick a name out of a hat for someone to tell a 3-minute spontaneous story. In keeping with that, Roscoe took a hat and put some names in it. Well, that's not exactly true. He put a name in it and then wrangled his mother into telling a short, somewhat less than spontaneous story. And if you think that's strange, wait till you hear it. Odyssey fans, I give you Ursula Bachofer.
And my story takes place in 1978, the summer right after I graduated high school. I started my very first job at a daylight donut shop in Junction City, Kansas. Pretty easy job, all the donuts you could eat. The worst part of the job was I had to be to work every morning at 4 a.m. And at the time I lived on Fort Riley, which was a base that was connected to Junction City. And to get to the town, you had to travel about 1.5 miles of a very, very dark road. So during this time, because I was traveling that road, my dad would tell me stories about, police officers that would pull young women over. Also, he told me one particular story where a military police officer had found this couple at a parking in a lover's lane, and he murdered them. So he would tell me all these horror stories, but he also told me that if I ever got pulled over on that stretch of road, to make sure not to stop just to keep going into town to the nearest gas station, and then I could stop. And he also said, make sure you get the officer's badge number. Well, you just listen halfway because you're a teenager. And first of all, I wasn't going to get stopped. I followed the rules. So here's where the strange stuff starts. I was leaving for work at 3:30 a.m. like I did every day. And I just hit that dark patch of road. It was so dark. There were no lights, no houses, only trees. That particular night, there wasn't even a moon. But I'm traveling along, and the only light is my own. There's not even cars coming toward me. But out of the corner of my eye, I happened to notice a car pulled over on the opposite side of the road. Just kind of caught a glimpse of it. I just went on past, didn't think too much of it. I looked in my rearview mirror, and I noticed his headlights came on. Still not too worried, figured he was heading on down the road. Well, he made a U-turn, and he started to follow me. He followed me about a half a mile. I couldn't tell what type of car it was or anything, but pretty soon the flashing lights of the police car came on. So instinct, I just pulled over. As a police officer, you pull over. So I did. And I'm pulled over. My car is still running. I'm not going to turn it off. I had the lights on, the dome lights on, and I'm waiting for the officer to come or whatever he was going to do. Well, pretty soon his light bar went off. And his headlights went off, and he just had his parking lights on. And then he came out to the car, and I rolled my window down about an inch. And he said, ma'am, I need you to step out of the car. And I said, I'm not stepping out of the car. And he said, well, you need to step out of the car. I said, I'm not going to. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, your car matches a description of a vehicle that was stolen in the next town. Again, warning bells in my head, thinking, how can he even have seen what type of car I was driving or color or anything? So I just went ahead and handed him my registration and my driver's license through the window. And he walked away and went to his car. He was there for quite a while, and I'm thinking, okay, this is my chance to get away. I can just drive to the next gas station. But I was terrified. I thought, what if the gas station isn't, what if they're not open? It's 3:30, by then 3:40 in the morning. And so I just sat there. I just waited. And pretty soon the officer comes back, and he hands me my driver's license and my registration. And he says to me, okay. He said, but this doesn't have your telephone number on it. And I just looked at him wondering, why do you need my telephone number? And so first thing I asked was, well, I need your badge number. And he just laughed at me. And he walked away back to his car, turned his headlights on, made a U-turn, and sped off down the road. I thought, okay. So I drove off. And I'm thinking the whole time, what the hell just happened? Was the guy trying to scare me? Or was he trying to date me? I was so shook up. Thankfully, I never got stopped again on that road, because I can guarantee you I would not have stopped. I would have just kept going, and if that gas station would have been closed, I'd have still kept going. Thank you.
Thanks, Mom, for sharing that spontaneous story with Odyssey. And thanks also for not getting murdered way back then, or I wouldn't be here to broadcast from this beautiful padded cell. Our next storyteller is the founder of the Tucson Comedy Alliance. She's also a published writer and is no stranger to storytelling stages, having appeared on the Female Storytellers Fist stage here in Tucson, as well as the Moth stage. So it's my pleasure to welcome Linda Ray with a story of a stranger in a strange land.
In the winter of 1989, there were 11 straight weeks I never saw the sun in Chicago. So when I had an opportunity to spend a week of the following February in the equatorial climate of Managua, Nicaragua, I jumped on it. It was a work-study trip. We were going to stay with local families, and we were going to help build a little cottage in a barrio at the very edge of Managua. I didn't know a thing about Nicaragua. As the plane landed, I didn't even know how much I didn't know about where I was. Our guide, Alfonso, was waiting for us with a tour bus outside the airport. We climbed on board and we drove for many miles through agricultural land. Agriculture is the main industry in Nicaragua. They were growing Brussels sprouts, he said. Nicaraguans don't eat Brussels sprouts. They were destined for the American market. Nicaraguans exported mainly coffee beans, but they didn't process it in Nicaragua. It was actually cheaper for them to buy freeze-dried, imported, so they drank Nescafe. As we approached the city, we started to see some kind of modern buildings. The biggest one was the tower of the Hyatt Hotel. But then we got closer and things were a little more, well, not kept up as well. They kind of getting decrepit. I don't want to say they were falling apart, but they had holes in them. They had holes in them. They had bullet holes in them. They had big holes, like from big shells, and they had bigger holes that had to be from bombs or something, but there were still people doing business in them. There were banks, there were retail stores, there were folks walking around on the sidewalk. They just kind of stepped over the debris. Alfonso explained that all that was left from the Sandinista triumph over the evil dictator Somoza. But I knew that was more than a decade ago. Somebody asked about the Contra, and Alfonso explained, oh no, they're out in the campo, out on the countryside. Our first stop was the Cathedral of Santiago. It was kind of a wreck, but Alfonso explained that it was one of the few structures left standing, well, part of it was left standing, from the 1972 earthquake. He said the whole center city was level, but just last week, the country had elected a new president, Violeta Chamorro, and part of her program was to rebuild the center city of Managua. We knew she was at least going to rebuild the cathedral because the guy who founded Domino's Pizza had paid for that already. We moved on. The next stop was, it was the Mercado Oriental. Alfonso said it was the largest, most popular outdoor market in all of Nicaragua. Today it was practically vacant. I mean, there were hardly anybody in the stalls. What's going on here, Alfonso? He explained that last week, when she was elected, Violeta Chamorro had taken the reins of the economy and called for a monetary policy that was going to cut back the inflation that at that point was 1,800%, something like that. The problem was that effectively every Nicaraguan could only buy 20% of what they had been able to buy the week before. And then he said a really alarming thing. He said, and he said he wasn't the only one who thought this, he said he thought Chamorro's conservative government was trying to provoke another insurrection so that the United States would come prop up the economy in Nicaragua to keep it from falling again into the hands of the Sandinista. Then we walked across the street to the Comedor Ben Linder. The Comedor is, it's like a little restaurant, and it was run by the mothers of heroes and martyrs. They were the mothers and wives of men who had been killed in the Contra War. The woman who greeted us was so welcoming, so warm and kind. It was like she wanted us to think of ourselves as her children. It was such a blessing after what was kind of a rough morning. After we ordered and she brought our food, she explained that the Comedor Ben Linder was named after Benjamin Linder, an American. Ben Linder had come to help the Sandinista. He was an engineer, and he came to help the Sandinista take hydroelectric power out to the campo, the people in the countryside. But he was also a clown, and he was beloved throughout the whole country. He was the only clown that many Nicaraguan children had ever seen. And the women decided to name the Comedor after him instead of choosing from among their husbands and sons, because he had been killed by the Contra on April 18th of 1986, just 4 years before we got there. As we left, she held each of our hands and she looked into our faces and she said, Remember what you have seen here. Go tell the United States and its people, we pray for them. As we got on the bus, Alfonso told us that she had actually lost 3 sons to the Contra, and one of them had been dropped from a U.S. Navy helicopter into the active Messiah volcano. Later, we saw a cross dedicated to him. My stomach turned. From there, we started a long drive to the barrio, which was at the edge of the city and then beyond the edge of the city. And I started wondering, like, where does this campo actually start? You know, Alfonso's told us not to worry. Everything's out in the countryside, and here we are. The sun had already set when we got to the barrio. As we were sorting our luggage, we got surrounded by children, and their faces were so open and happy. It was like wonder. They'd never seen Americans before. And then in the corner, kind of behind where they were standing, I saw a remarkable looking woman. She was very tall and had a lot of composure and confidence, but she was motherly. And it turned out that was like Dona Inez, and she was going to be my hostess for a week. We went back to her cottage, which was small. She shared it with her daughter-in-law and her granddaughter. She took me to my room and showed me it had a cot on one side and a cupboard on one side and a chair next to the cupboard, and then there was a little window over the whole thing. We chatted for a minute. It turns out that she had a daughter who was a school teacher. She was studying then in Cuba, and her son was an officer in the Army. He was stationed out in the campo. I was exhausted. I mean, it had been a long day for sure, but it just seemed like a ricochet back and forth from being happy and excited and depressed. And it just took me down. I just went to bed and I went to sleep. And boom! All of a sudden there was boom! And I woke up and I sat up straight and I opened my eyes and then I closed them again real quick because all I could see was a streak of moonlight through the curtains. I lay back down, boom! I opened my eyes again with just a slit light. Would I be less scared if I got under this cot? And as I looked around, I saw in a chair, that chair, there was a woman. There was an old woman, motionless, watching me. Boom! No, she was watching over me. She was watching over me with some kind of immutable grace, some benediction. It was calming to watch her. And as the boom stopped and I watched her watching me, I found I really cared about that woman. She reminded me of the woman we'd met at the Commodore. I fell asleep, and when I woke up in the morning, I got dressed really fast and I bounded into the central room of the cottage. And there was Inez. She was humming. La Dona Inez was humming and sweeping the dirt floor. She said good morning and asked if I wanted bread and coffee. The rest of the family had eaten long before. And then she said, I apologize for all the noise of the mangoes falling on the roof last night. Mangoes. There were mangoes falling on a tin roof. It was nothing at all. It was nothing at all. I didn't mention the old woman, though, because to this day, I don't know. She could have been real, but I kind of doubt it. But I know what she was there for, because I will tell you that nothing else could have prepared me for the Nicaraguan people. Their combination of beneficence and resistance, they were just remarkable people, and they all had the same message for us. All the following week, we heard the same thing that we heard from the mother in the Commodore. Remember the reality that you see here. Alfonso even said he expected that one day the disenfranchised people in the United States would rise up and we would learn about our own problems that caused so many problems in the rest of the world. He said he feared some of us would die in the conflict. Remember the reality that you see here. Go tell the United States and the American people, we pray for them.
Thank you, Linda. What a great story. I first met Bobby Alvarez in 2014 when we were both working on our master's in public administration degrees. Working on that degree was instrumental to my getting involved with Odyssey because almost every class I took required a presentation of some sort. And as I have told many times, I was petrified of public speaking. Odyssey helped me get over that fear by giving me the opportunity to share stories that I love to tell in front of an audience. Of all the strange things that have happened in my life, nothing is stranger to me than the idea that not only am I comfortable speaking to large groups of people, I'm actually pretty good at it. Well, Bobby Alvarez has a lot to do with that. From the first time I saw him present in our human resources class, I knew that Bobby was a naturally gifted speaker and storyteller. From that point on, I watched him and took notes on the way he presented himself on stage, and more than once we worked together on my own presentation style. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce, for the first time on the Odyssey stage, Bobby Alvarez.
I'm going to tell the story of La Vieja. Now, the setting for this is while I was serving as a Peace Corps volunteer in El Salvador from 2007 to 2010. Now, during my time, I lived in a small village, Cathedral of Santa Paula, that sat nestled along the side of the Pan American Highway. It was a beautiful community, rural, covered in cornfields and bean. And there were also stretches of the community that were completely covered by jungle and forest. One such area was a stretch of the old Pan American Highway that everyone in the community referred to as La Vieja. Now, at one point, all traffic that was going from one part of Central America to the other would pass by on this road. But about 30 years ago, the road was abandoned for a new one that was just built. And from that time on, the jungle and the forest began to retake that road. And that is what you see behind me right now, La Vieja. What it had turned into was a completely overgrown piece of land with different spots of asphalt left over, reminiscent of its former life as a main highway. But it had slowly become a trail through one of the darkest parts of the community. Now, during the day, it was absolutely beautiful. There were large conocoste trees with their bead-like seeds that would fall all over the ground. There was shade given from forest and tropical trees alike. It was a really cool place to walk through during the day. But at night, things changed a little bit. At night, everything was dark. You went from this really bright area to a really dark and eerie sight. But along that path, I saw some of the most beautiful things in my life. After the first rainfall, you would have the birth of these brand new lightning bugs. And I remember one night walking along La Vieja and feeling as if I was walking into the universe. I was surrounded by thousands of lightning bugs surrounding me on all sides, going deep into the jungle. All I could see was these shining, shimmering lights, and I felt like I was literally walking through space. It was an amazing experience. Then there were other times where the experiences weren't so miraculous. There was one time where I was walking home from my host mom. She was my Salvadoran mother that took care of me. And I was walking from her house to my friend's house to eat some cusuco, some armadillo, which was a common dish, traditional dish down there. And so I had to walk along La Vieja at night. And as I'm walking, out of nowhere, I heard a rustling, and I looked, and this small white dog creature ran out of the bushes and ran in a circle around me. And I could hear its nails, its claws digging into the ground, and I could hear it huffing and puffing. It ran in a circle around me and ran right back into the bushes. I had never seen anything like that before. I thought it might have been a dog, maybe a rabbit. I had no clue. So I thought it was weird. Got to my buddy's house, and he's making the table and getting everything ready for dinner. And I told him the story. And he's like, "Oh, you saw the cadejo blanco?" Now, I spoke Spanish, but I had never heard the word cadejo before. And so I asked him, like, what is the cadejo? And he goes on to tell me that it's a Mayan lore, that it's a small white dog-like creature that runs in a circle around you to protect you from imminent evil. It's a good spirit that's meant to protect good people. Freaked me out in the moment. I didn't feel like I was being protected, but I was very thankful because he also told me about the Cadejo Blanco or the Cadejo Negro, the black Cadejo, which is the one that comes out and wants to hurt people. So like I said, beautiful pathway, but some weird experiences. But there was one experience that stands out more than the rest. Now, this was another late night, closer to midnight. I was just leaving La Última of a family friend that had passed away. So La Última is a year after their death. You get together with the family, drink coffee, and you eat sweet bread and just congregate and talk and celebrate their lives. So I'm walking back close to midnight by myself, back along La Vieja, dark as usual with a few stars just piercing the canopy over my head. And as I'm walking forward, at the end of this long pathway, there's a street lamp. And that street lamp has on both sides tall corn stalks. Now these corn stalks grow twice as tall as normal corn stalks because they get sun all day and then light from the lamp at night. So they don't produce corn, but they grow up to 10 or 12 feet. Now what this did is near that street lamp, they cast a long shadow. So as I'm walking, I see the outline of a young woman, which was really weird. I knew everyone on that side of the village, and there were not a lot of young women, much less young women that would be walking by themselves at midnight in rural El Salvador. And as I'm watching her, I couldn't quite tell who it was. Her shape was going in and out of the light. So I'd see her from the light on the lamp, just her shadow, and then she'd walk into the shadows of the corn stalks. So I could see her shape kind of coming into view and then fading. Until finally she got to the end of La Vieja. And right there was what was called a palanquera, which is basically a U-shaped piece of wood that would allow people to pass through, but not cows. And from that palanquera, there was a fork in the road. You can either take the path upward, and you can go to the new Pan American Highway, and I could walk along that road and get to my house. The other path down below would take you down by a creek, a densely covered forest, and then you'd come out into a cornfield, walk through the cornfield, then hop a wall, and you could get to my house. Now, as soon as that young lady got to the palanquera, she stopped dead in her tracks, and she turned around and looked right at me. Now, that was odd because I was at least 70 yards behind her. And from my perspective, there was no way she could have known that I was behind her. So she stopped and turns, and then turns back and goes and takes the path to the right up to the new Pan American Highway. Now, at this point, I'm starting to get a little nervous. I'm thinking, you know, along the Pan American, it's known that people will get robbed. So I'm thinking to myself, you know, I don't have a lot, but I still would not want to get robbed at this point. So my thought was maybe she has some friends hiding in the bushes up there or something. So as I get to this fork in the road, that's what I'm thinking about, one path. Then I start thinking about that lower path. If there are thieves up there that are getting ready to rob me, maybe I should take this other path where I'd go down through a forest, over a creek, through a cornfield, and to my house. But then I started thinking, what if there was by some far-fetched chance, some type of evil thing? Of course, they'd want me to go by myself to this creek and be in the middle of this cornfield at midnight. So I decided to take my chances with the thieves. So I pick up a large rock that was sitting right there next to the trail, and I hold it in my hand as if that was going to defend me against a gun. And so I slowly walk up the path. And at the top of the hill, that young lady is standing there by herself. I get closer and closer. I'm looking around in the bushes and I don't see anyone, so I drop the rock and I reach for my cell phone and I turn on the light. Now, as I'm walking, I want to get an idea of who it is. So I turn the light in her face and I say, "Buenas, good evening." And as soon as I said that, the light shone down. And what I saw was a face that was contorted, deformed, something I had never seen, something that did not look human. And in that moment, I don't think I was staring for more than 0.4 of a second. But in that moment, my heart started beating, I started sweating, and I instantly got scared. I put the lamp down, said, "Have a nice night," and took off running down the Pan American Highway. The entire time as I'm going down the Pan American, I'm praying, "Lord, please don't let her be standing on my porch or inside of my house." I get to my house and thank God she's not there. Needless to say, I did not have a great night of sleep. So the next day, I walk along this same path, but this time it's illuminated by the bright sun. And I walk back to my host mom's site. Blanca's house. And I get there, and her mother, who's pushing 90 at the time, she's sitting there in the hammock in the front yard, and I go up to her and I tell her, Niña Loli, I saw something crazy last night. And I proceed to tell her the story. She leans back in her hammock and she looks at me. She's like, that was a Siguanaba. And I'm like, what do you mean? And she proceeds to tell me the story of the Siguanaba, which is an evil spirit that appears as a young woman. And when you get closer, it turns into a demon and carries you off. Now, the Siguanaba typically targets men who are not faithful. But what she told me is that she deemed me a faithful man, so decided only to scare me instead of taking me away. But she proceeded to tell me that they used to come out, these spirits used to show themselves to people a lot more before electricity and everything came into the community. So I should count myself scared, but also fortunate that I was able to interact with this ancient spirit. And that is the story of La Vieja. Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby, for sharing that crazy tale of La Vieja, a road I will probably never want to walk down in my life. Well, that brings us to the end of our Stranger Things show. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us for either the YouTube version or on the podcast. Now, Steve, are you familiar with the concept of the harbinger in horror movies?
Isn't that like in An American Werewolf in London? There's that scene in the pub where people keep telling them, beware the moors, don't go out on the moors.
Right. It's always the person or like the old man in Friday the 13th, as the kids are getting ready to drive to Crystal Lake, he stops them and says, don't go to Crystal Lake. You're going to be doomed. And, you do it anyway, because then there'd be no movie if they turned around. But
yeah, they'd be pretty short movies if you listen to them.
In September of 2019, I hosted a show with Molly McCloy, and the theme was disaster. And at the time, we thought it was pretty apt that we were doing a disaster show while the rainforests were on fire and the United States was being pummeled by hurricanes at that time. We gave updates on the hurricanes, and I made sort of a joke in September of 2019. Boy, holding a disaster show while we're having disasters, I hope this isn't a harbinger for worse things to come. So I'm a little scared to put out Stranger Things in October of 2020. It kind of strains the imagination that things could get weirder than they are right now.
Well, we had no way of knowing how weird they were going to get up to this point. Who knows what could happen next? I was reading recently about the Mount Lemmon Observatory, and they're one of the places that look for near-Earth objects, and they're always hunting for asteroids and things that are coming close to the planet. So, it always could get weirder and worse.
Yeah. So this is your co-harbingers signing off from Stranger Things, and hopefully there'll be an Odyssey show for the rest of this year. But please join us, or please look on odysseystorytelling.com for the upcoming shows that we have for the rest of this year, and try to be safe.
And while you're on the website, there's a donation button where you can go to our PayPal site. Give whatever you can, or share it with your friends. Thanks very much for watching our show. Good night, Roscoe.
You're doomed.